Welcome to Let's Talk Global Business, the show in which we look at the economic and business trends connecting the world. I'm Sara Murray, Managing Director International at the Conference Board, the member-led global think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. In this episode, we're exploring the semiconductor race, the chips powering everything from AI and defense systems to the world's digital economy. As nations race to maintain technological security, semiconductors have become central to both industrial strategy and global power. To help me unpack things, I'm joined by two guests today, Daniel M. Gerstein, Senior Policy Researcher and Professor of Policy Analysis at the Rand School of Public Policy, and Dan Wong, Managing Director at Horizon 3 Partners and Senior Fellow at the Conference Board. Welcome.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So to kick things off, I'm going to ask you both a simple question. Will chips decide the next big war? Daniel, do you want to go first?
Yeah, certainly. Well, look, I don't think there's any way to escape it. I mean, we are in the information age, and the semiconductor is at the heart of the information age. And, warfare is a human endeavor, and I certainly see that advanced nations or nations engaged in warfare are going to rely ever increasing amounts on these very important components. So absolutely, we're seeing it unfold even today in Russia, Ukraine, where we're watching innovation, digital innovation occur literally in a matter of, days to weeks. And it's just extraordinary to see. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Dan?
Well, we are in the chip war right now. And I remember I started my career actually in Silicon Valley, kind of in the heart of where chips are designed. This was 20 years ago, during a time when it wasn't so hot. And now you see an economy that is driven by silicon technology. And so in today's environment, we're already in the chip war. There have been different iterations of this, but now we're in the newest iteration. And we're living it right now. And I think the interesting thing to be aware of is actually in terms of the question around, will chips determine the next war? We're in the chip war already. And there's a very natural focus on the semiconductor chip itself. But actually, the broader thing is a bit dangerous just to focus on the chip. Actually, it's much broader than that. And the war right now is actually being determined by the broader tech stack, of which, of course, the chip and the semiconductor is a core component of it, but not the only component.
So it's striking how semiconductors have become like both the enabler and the pressure point of 21st century power, and that this battle, this war that we're already in, it isn't just physical, it's like you said, industrial, it's digital, and kind of whoever controls the chip supply chain. What's the difference between advanced and foundational chips, and why does that matter? Dan?
Yeah, I think the term chip, it's very easy to forget. There are many, many different kinds of semiconductor chips. And very often when we hear the term in the media, as in this context, people focus on one particular kind of chips, and they're more the foundational chips. These are the very, very high-end, state-of-the-art types of chips, lots of them measured by nanometers. And nanometers has always been a metric in terms of measuring the sophistication of these chips. And so, of course, a smaller the dimension, right, going from like 28 to 7 to 3, even smaller. The smaller that number, the more sophisticated the chip. And that's really been a lot of the focus around lots of the embargoes and things of that sort. And it's easy to forget that actually there's a broader ecosystem of chips. And some of these chips are mature chips. They've been around maybe in terms of the cutting edge technology, but not the top. But it's still, for a system to work, you need multiple mixtures of chips. And these more mature chips normally measure at like larger nanometers. So for example, the typical number is a 28 nanometer. It would be considered like open technology. Anybody can build it. And I think when we think about that, we tend to forget that those are a very, very important piece of the system as well. And the other part is to note that the embargoes and the restrictions are on the foundational chips, where there are no, and this is kind of where the West is leading very much, with less of the production. But then in terms of actually the mature chips, right, these things, memory, all these other pieces, actually China in particular contributes 60% of the
Wow.
production there. And so, so I think it's very, very important to have a more balanced view in terms of the broader ecosystem within semiconductors and chips.
Okay, thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, so I mean, just to put a very fine point on this, when we talk about foundational chips, I mean they're in everything that we have a digital connection to. So they're in all kinds of devices. Cars use literally hundreds of them in every single car. Medical equipment and industrial machinery. So they're everywhere and they're ubiquitous, and we sort of use them without thinking about it. And as Dan said, they're not controlled, at least at the larger ones that have been around for quite some time. But what we're really talking about today, and the important ones that we have at least placed a lot of importance on in terms of things like artificial intelligence, and in particular, artificial general intelligence, is the idea of these advanced chips. And they're the ones that give you the ability for high performance computing. They give you the ability to develop the neural networks that we believe are going to lead to this path of artificial general intelligence. That's an interesting question that we should come back to. And then, the machine learning and such. So we're starting to see those chips find their way and become foundational in some ways. If you want to have advanced capabilities, if you want to have a high performance computing on the move, you're going to need the more advanced chips. And so, as Dan points out, as the chips get smaller, they become more advanced. And at the higher end, the 2 nanometer, those are the ones that we're really having a lot of dialogue about. And they're the ones that are, the most valuable for the future.
Mm-hmm. So I think that distinction really matters, right? I think what I'm hearing is that the world's attention is all on the high-end AI chips, but it's the mature or the foundational kind of chips, the ones that power the cars and the weapons that kind of underpin the everyday life and national security. And that's the area that China dominates, that layer of the market, right? The 60%.
That's correct. I mean, they are very much using those chips in order to manufacture the different components. It's interesting just to take an example. During COVID, when the supply chains were disrupted, the impact in the United States was that we could not get access to those chips any longer because the supply chains had been shut down because workers weren't able to work. And so we couldn't build cars. And we had a backlog of cars, which drove the prices of cars up. So you're seeing a very real impact, even of the lower end chips that are so ubiquitous. If you lose access, you're going to affect other things within your manufacturing and supply chains.
Okay. So how did China manage to dominate production of these so-called kind of mature chips so quickly? Dan, Wong, do you want to take that?
Sure. It's very much playing to the strength that China's been building over decades, right? Just basic manufacturing, right? Manufacturing that doesn't necessarily require the most precise equipment, the most difficult types of procedures. And so this kind of been playing very much to that strength. Of course, at a high level, China has very, very, I guess, well-planned, thought through technology roadmaps and industrial policies. And so, semiconductors, along with lots of other technology areas, was very early on, identified as a focus area. So it's not something that just happened overnight. It's been built up over decades, and I guess the technological barrier to build these mature chips is lower. And so, given the size of the China market, and then coupled with this manufacturing, that then helped bring up the semiconductor in terms of building mature chips. It's very much related to this supply chain as well. I mean, this is one reason why people say supply chains are so difficult to split out, because you have different components working within a close geography.
Interesting. Daniel, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would add also that I agree with what Dan said, that, it is definitely the sweet spot of China to be able to do this manufacturing. I mean, they have about 28% of the manufacturing globally. United States has about 17. And so between the two, we're almost 50% of the manufacturing. But there's another piece going on here, and that is the global supply chain for the very advanced chips has actually been pretty well articulated. And it starts with the US and the UK doing the intellectual property and the development of the chips. You know, it runs through India doing the verification of the chip designs. You have the Netherlands with these very advanced machines that are used for lithography. And so, you know, those types of capabilities aren't necessarily available to the Chinese. And so they're actually, you know, now trying to buy up some of the older machinery that does lithography so that they can have more capability there. But, you know, the highest end of the lithography machines are extremely expensive and they're very tightly controlled. And it's not something that the Chinese can readily gain access to. So they're operating in their sweet spot and they're a manufacturing superpower.
It's fascinating how Beijing's scale and that state coordination has created such momentum. I'm interested in that. Meanwhile, you know, Washington's focused on the more cutting edge chips, but as you made the point during COVID, it kind of leaves the industrial base exposed. So my question is, why has Washington focused so much just on the cutting edge, not the older chips? Neil, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit about this. I mean, I think Washington has developed, and I'm using that term very broadly, but I think that the concept is that here in the United States, you know, we have been looking toward this competition on artificial general intelligence. And I think that has colored a lot of the way we've thought about where we should place emphasis and how we should think about controlling the technologies. And as part of that, you know, we have said, if you want to be the leader in artificial general intelligence, and we believe that's important because whoever gets there first will have a leg up to make sure that it's designed in certain ways, that it will conform to certain standards, those kinds of approaches. And so I think the investment has been on the higher end chips to get to that artificial general intelligence and, you know, then be able to reap the benefits of having gotten there first. And I don't necessarily mean freezing out everybody else.
Yeah. Dan, anything you want to add?
Well, there's another point I want to add, and that is, you know, kind of your question was around focus on the very most sophisticated chips. And what I'm seeing is that the battle lines are shifting fairly broadly. And so not only do we have different types of chips, but it's no longer just about the chip, but the larger ecosystem and supply chain around that. In other words, the full tech stack is now kind of in, if you will. Earlier, Daniel mentioned some of the equipment even to manufacturing these machines, the ones from ASML, for example, in the Netherlands, right? That is not part of that control point. Now, you know, even when people are thinking about building up the capability for artificial general intelligence, which seems to be maybe the big battle that's happening right here, you know, when people talk about building the data centers and the capability to enable something like an AGI, you know, in the past they quoted number of GPUs, like number of chips. And now it's shifted to actually gigawatts. Now people talk about, well, in order to provide that level of intelligence, we need to do X number of gigawatts. And so it's very shifted. It's already shifted across the tech stack into even energy. You are a number of tokens or your intelligence per energy. And that then goes beyond just the chip itself into the much broader tech ecosystem and even into energy, right? And so the battle lines are shifting very, very broad, very, very quickly. And once we look at it that way, different geographies, different governments, different countries have different strengths.
Interesting. Let's talk about the CHIPS Act itself. What does it actually do, and is it working? Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a hard one to actually answer, at least the second part. On the first part, I mean, the CHIPS Act was sort of the recognition that there needed to be something. And I wrote a book called Tech Wars back in 2022. And in Tech Wars, I argue that there needed to be something in the United States like an industrial policy light. We're not heavy-handed in trying to control industry, or we haven't been. And, whereas the Chinese have developed the idea of military civil fusion, and, it's sharing back and forth with great regularity. So, when we think about the CHIPS Act, it was really a step in the direction toward this industrial policy light. And what it was intending to do was to give a focused effort. It was intended to provide incentives, for example, on manufacturing, to help build facilities, to support, to provide those subsidies, giving tax credits. The research and development became a focal area. And so, there was a lot that was rolled up in there to try to set the conditions or place the United States in a position to be able to lead in what was seen as this future environment moving to AGI. It also had components in it, such as workforce development, which are very important. And so all of that comes together. So you asked the second question, how are we doing? And I would say that's a little more difficult to actually place because, under the Biden administration, they had a certain viewpoint. And that viewpoint ran through organizations like the National Science Foundation that was created back in the, late 50s, early 60s. And its purpose was to work and provide funding for a basic and applied research and early stage development. And, what's happened is that in the Trump administration, they have taken a different viewpoint. And part of that viewpoint is that funding for organizations like the National Science Foundation, like our academic research centers, you hear about what's going on in higher education. And the question is, how is that going to affect the ability for research and development, not just in semiconductors, but in biotech and all the other different areas where the competition for technology is occurring. And so how do I think it's working? I think there are still vestiges of the CHIPS Act that are working, but I do see that there is a loss of momentum, particularly on the research and development. There have been delays in some of the implementation.
So, again, it sounds like the CHIPS Act is this reassertion of industrial policy, something that the US hasn't done in decades, but that it's bumping up against those constraints of speed, finding the talent, and but rebuilding that kind of capacity, that reshoring takes more time than originally envisaged. But on to my next question. So how can or should other advanced economies, if we think about Europe, Japan, Korea, how should they respond to the US-China chip race? Dan?
Yeah, it's a good question because so much of the attention in the development of especially artificial intelligence, let's say, to simplify things, kind of artificial intelligence kind of being this capability that is central to each nation's sovereignty and security, right? To that extent, each nation needs to have their own ownership and independence in that area. And yet lots of the focus tends to be on two particular nations, US and China, for very well-known reasons, and it makes a lot of sense. And and many places feel like they're kind of caught in the middle. They have the size of the economy, the size of the market, and the size of the financial market to basically fund the types of development, whether it is research, whether it is building the infrastructure needed to make it run, right? So that's naturally why the focus in these two locations. But they're different parts of the value chain. And now more and more we're seeing that beyond just building larger and larger data centers, there's lots of areas where nations themselves can innovate on the application side of things. And even if you were to take a look at the United States and China, there is a bit of a different angle in terms of how these two nations are approaching it. I think the US, in my opinion, is focused on a very, very horizontal, infrastructure-led type of an approach that leads to AGI, this tool that is useful for everything. If you take a look at China, the angle is a bit different. And it's much more around more vertical applications of the technology, maybe less the foundational capabilities, and more around the diffusion of the technology across all sorts of use cases. And so I think even between these two nations, there's quite a bit of a difference in terms of how it's being approached for a variety of different reasons. And I think if I were kind of in a different geography, I would be thinking about, number one, how do I take advantage of some of these developments coming from both of these areas? A lot of the development now is around making these models open source, meaning that you're able to see the weights, meaning that you're able to take it and kind of fine tune and build your own models. And so one piece I think that I'm seeing is that these models from both the East and the West, widely available in an open source way, you can use it to build your own tech stack.
Thank you. Daniel?
I think what Dan said was on target. What I would offer, though, is one sort of dilemma, and I think the dilemma is caused by the United States. I mean, essentially, we've put our allies and our competitors in a bit of an uncertain space with some of the moves that have taken place. So, you have these allies, Europe, European Union, NATO allies, you have Japan and Korea. And, so they're looking at the US-China competition, and, they don't want to be left out on either side of this, right? Because it's not clear any longer how the alliances are going to stack up. And so I think they're looking and trying to balance the kinds of cooperation to ensure that they still stay in tune with, friendly with the United States. But I think they also recognize that they are going to have to go and develop some indigenous capacities there as well. So we're likely to see more nations come together and try to figure out what their role is going to be to ensure their semiconductor technology and their access to semiconductors will remain well into the future.
Interesting. If I summarize, it's almost like that for the West, it can't just be like a subsidy race. It's about building a trusted ecosystem, linking the US, Europe, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, or linking all of them together somehow in a network that's kind of resilient to shocks, but still open enough to drive the innovation. And, is the future of chips, will it depend as much on partnership as it does on protectionism?
Yeah, just one note. I mean, it's interesting that the tariffs have really had an enormous shock to the system, because when you start talking about tariffs, this could affect the semiconductor industry for our allies. And, what would that mean if every car that you're selling has, several hundred to 1,000 semiconductors in it? That's going to increase the cost of the car. And so, now you're starting to look at the economics. It's not just a national security issue, but it's a economic issue. It's also a technological leadership issue. And all of these come together in this semiconductor race, this competition that we're engaged in.
So really, semiconductors are no longer a quiet sector. They've become the scaffolding of economic and geopolitical power, but a very complicated picture, because you've got to balance security with openness and competition with cooperation. So not an easy one to get right. We're going to take a short break. Please note that you can access the Conference Board's global innovation reports and other content on geopolitics on our website.
Part 2 of this episode will be released shortly.